Okay, is everybody? Oh, not quite, not quite. Okay, everybody ready?
I'm ready.
Yeah. This second talk, which crosses over with a lot of what Stuart has been talking about, and I've known Stuart really since I started growing mushrooms, and we met on a piece of work about 4 years ago, which was using plastic, but for very different reasons actually. And I've always had a great interest, particularly in the casing zone. And I think a lot of farms that I've been on over the years, it's just a basic principle of putting it on as quickly as possible, getting as many people out of the way as possible, and shutting the door. And in the late 80s, early 90s, in our part of the world, all of a sudden you could buy these ready mixed casings, and a lot of people treated them as ready-made, and I think to a certain extent we were all trying to emulate what the Dutch were doing at the time. And a lot of the casings we had prior to that, however much work you put into them, it was very difficult to get a structure that would hold up. You only ended up with a very small aggregate on the bed, which tended to allow mycelium to run much more profusely up from the compost. And when you would go to Holland or somewhere like that, you would see this individual growth that we just could not achieve. And I think after a while it became more and more obvious that it was a physical rather than a cultural aspect. And the first company I worked for was a big tray growing operation, and for about the first 18 months all I did was mix casing, work on the casing application, work on the casing after it was on the bed, and water casing. So all I got to see really was casing. But it did teach me how much you could manipulate what was going on in the cropping rooms and the areas that weren't really perhaps being given enough thought or consideration. And about 20 years later I bought my own farm with my wife, and we bought a very old run-down unit, and I think like all of these things it was a bit more run-down than we thought. But I had to find a very different technique to compete in a market that everybody said, oh well, you know, there's only you. No, there wasn't. All the supermarkets were dumping their mushrooms from the northwest of England in there at very low cost, very attractive to buyers. We had very limited air handling, and the interesting thing with this farm is that it runs on negative pressure, which you don't often come about these days. And there was no air handling as such, and at that point we found problems with the insulation of the roof, some of the walls, the doors, etc., etc. So when I got to the casing period, I just sealed it up in polythene to create what I believe to be the correct atmosphere to grow the mycelium through the casing to get it to the surface so that I could air and pin it. And we learnt by doing that that if we were in control of the spawn run, as when we took the business on originally, it was a phase 2 plant. And I was offered phase 3, and I was quite concerned at the beginning that we didn't have the tools to manage the phase 3. So we put off the decision to do it, and we struggled on with the phase 2. And then I went to talk to some other growers and saw some other farms, and one or two of my colleagues kept just pushing me in that direction. So we thought we would give it a go and shorten the cycle, which we did, and that became a successful move. But what we carried from the old way of doing it was a very deliberate way of managing the spawn rooms to make sure that we were totally in charge before we put the casing on the bed. Once we had achieved that, we were then able to start to grow the casing layer in a very specific manner, and we used the plastic for various periods of time, probably from about halfway through till before airing up. And we saw immediately that the speed of growth and mycelium development within the casing doubled, and it doubled at the right temperature, and we didn't actually get any overheating problems at all. So we were able to start to get to compete with the other farms and the other produce that we had to sell against. And that was our reason why, because we had no other way of doing it, and we didn't have any capital left to buy any other pieces of equipment. We were after a consistent, high quality output. We had a very patient customer who was very supportive of us at that stage, and desperately again wanted to have a local product. He was getting fairly fed up with being let down if the ferries were late or whatever, and the quality that would come into them from England could vary enormously, and maybe the mushrooms came from Poland or Ireland or the UK. This is a first flush. This actually was when I'd started using some of Stuart's compost supplement, and I think you, Martin, were asking about plastic. We used a lot of bubble wrap underneath the blocks because we had very limited facilities on the farm. Basically a fan that would draw air through the building from 2 vent ports and hot water pipes on the side of the wall. But we were still able to create the correct atmosphere both in the compost and, more importantly so, in the casing. We also grew white mushrooms and brown mushrooms in the same building because having a main customer, we were, like everybody else, given that choice. You can't have part of the order, you can have the full order. And the full order included white and brown, and flats and portobellos. And after I'd sort of sat down and thought about it and all the worries there were, we set out to do it. And I think one of the things that probably helped it work all the way around is that we were constantly with evaporation because we were drawing air through the building, and also we were taking the spores out, and we tended to set all the flat mushrooms on the top shelves so they were nearest to the extractor. This is a second flush, and Stuart was showing before some of these interflush mushrooms, which again we were able to grow out into significant size. And what really interested me once we got going with these supplements and our own techniques was the quality of these pins. And that was something we had not been able to do before. We had a pretty small, light mushroom, and it didn't keep well. It wasn't nice to pick, and in fact it made the picking very, very expensive because there were too many mushrooms on the beds, and we needed the mushrooms to make the weight. So we went down this exercise of less mushrooms on the bed but getting real weight out of the compost. This was taken about 3 weeks ago. This is one of my client in France's building. She grows 100% browns, but we've now transferred the same technique onto her farm. And interestingly enough, her buyers were similar to ours at the outset, or they didn't want big mushrooms. Now everybody gets seriously upset if they don't get big mushrooms. And I think one of the things that we had in the UK particularly was you weren't necessarily allowed to have big mushrooms because it didn't suit the supermarkets. But once you start slicing and cooking a product like that, it's just a revelation. And if you're a chef and you buy 7 kilos of mushrooms, you'll be cooking and flogging 7 kilos of mushrooms. So if you take the cheap alternative, the value pack or whatever it is, it's not a value pack because you need 2 or 3 packs to come up with the same amount of tissue to put on a plate. This aspect of quality mycelium and growth, this is at the end of a 3rd flush, and what is interesting is the casing hasn't shrunk. So the watering technique, the delivery of the structure and how you make your casing layer up, it's still there. A lot of casings tend to dry out, to shrink, the bed starts to shrink with it. The shrinkage you can't really see because our casing is that's probably shrunk the compost by about a centimetre from where we started, but the casing layer itself has stayed at a similar depth. But more importantly, you can see that what we set out to do to create this individual growth is still there and has been maintained all the way through the crop. I know that Stuart's been doing this work elsewhere where they've been watering over pin sets. We don't tend to do that, and we haven't been a part of that work. But what we have got is we've got a structure of casing, and it's able to reabsorb water very quickly without losing it by the end of the 1st flush, which is often easier to talk about than doing in practice. Okay, what I'd like to do is to just hand out a piece of paper that perhaps people could look at while we're talking about it. Okay, I think the first point that I would make is that most of the principles that I've taken about running spawn, I've taken from working with trays, quite large trays with quite big tonnages of compost in the rooms, because running a tray peak heat, a tray spawn running room, they're actually not easy to handle, and they certainly don't have the benefits of bulk systems where you have a mass of material being treated underneath in the same way. And I think one of the first things that I always looked at is that spawn, because it grows in cycles, it also grows in very distinct stages within the building, and that when you looked at the trays that you were running, and you can see all the little grains letting the spawn come off, it was really learning that once you got into the stages in the following week and it was starting to surge, that it wasn't just the individual pieces of spawn, it was the whole mass of the building. And something that I started to do quite early on was use extra fans so we could significantly increase the air movement in the building, because you never have enough chilling, but again there does come an economic limit at what is affordable and that you can use. So some of the problems that have been completed by not completing these spawn runs are deep and irregular pinning, an inability to water the casing effectively, and certainly in that instance you wouldn't, for example, have the quality of the casing at the 3rd flush. Obviously you've got much increased energy cost, because you're maybe needing to use more chilling, more air movement, you're taking a lot of heat out of the compost through the casing, so you're getting less growth in the casing and you're removing water that you're trying to water back in. So you end up, for example, with more labour to put water in, and you don't necessarily put that water in at the right time. The most important point probably, as I've put there, is this inability to carry out a setback period. I think most of you would know it as recovery, which is what the Dutch call it. I was trained originally with a setback. Some farms in Britain used to have what were called setback rooms, where they would push the case trays aside and they'd be left away to finish off before they were aired up. Any form of irregularity in an airing programme and the production inconsistencies it does, you usually can correct by going further back. So if I see that I've got a difficulty, I'm not really looking at that time, I'm looking at what happened before. And Stuart put a slide up earlier where he put 23, 24 degrees. We try at all times to run our compost through that, and I think you said down here that you can find it quite difficult in the summer when the compost comes in too warm. We delay the casing, we use more chilling, we use more air movement. If at night time we can use ventilation, we do, but we will do everything in our power to bring the compost down. But until we can see that temperature breaking, if that's the case, we do not case, because otherwise you simply incubate the heat in the bed, and then when you're looking to air up, you're going to be at a higher temperature range, an incorrect range in my opinion, and you will find that your pinning is much weaker. We used to get a very strange phenomenon where you could almost come back the following morning and it looked like you got less mycelium, and I suspect you probably did, because if you think about the ideal temperature for spawn, it's 24.7, so we'll say 25. If that growing tip is coming to the surface and the room is perhaps 22 and maybe the compost is 25, 26, it's not an issue. But if the compost is 28, 30 or even more, that 28, 30 has to come past the surface mycelium. So where you're going to ultimately form your pin is being damaged by a very high temperature at that point. So it's more important to us to not let that happen. I think you can have a major effect on your picking spread, again, because of how you manage the spawn to be able to get it to grow in a more controlled manner through the casing period. And then there are the obvious points that you have with reduced shelf life and quality when you've got poor spawn runs, for whatever problem, whether it's about managing the spawn room or maybe you've some compost that is not perhaps how you would like it. So the loss of yield, the loss of timing, to a certain extent, if you look at where these difficulties are coming from, in many instances you can rectify them to a very high standard. Some of the key issues that we've identified is very much compost supply, and in part this is why my client at the moment is making this major step, because we rely on ferries and it's not always a very comfortable place to be, and as you rightly say, your compost turns up at 30-35 degrees, but there are companies now in Europe who are shipping out much lower temperature products that go to other parts of the world. So I think that, you know, if you're seeing your compost come in at a very high temperature, it's something maybe you need to be talking to a supplier about. We don't see a lot of pest and disease problems, and really through our management to this point, we've pretty much grown away from competitors, because we're not growing at the temperatures that they want to be using as well. I think you can have very sophisticated control systems that on a screen, on a printout, look fantastic, but most times you really need to look at what is really being monitored and what's really being adjusted, and what to you as the grower at that point is the important parameter. There are stages where you have a mix of temperature and atmosphere, airing for example, or you have a stage once crops are pinned, which is really more of a resting stage, so the compost isn't going to change. You're more interested in your air movement, your humidity and the temperature that you run the room at, and how that perhaps relates to what temperature you want to grow mushrooms at. So it's easy to rely on control systems. Getting to understand what they're really controlling and what you want them to do is quite a different thing altogether. There are obviously the importance of compost compaction. You know, if it's very dense, very wet, you don't particularly want to overdo it. You want to try and keep it more open so that you can get more control. And again, if you're putting in fill weights that you can't control, I really don't see any sense in doing that at all. And Stuart's talked to me about it on a number of occasions from some of his work elsewhere. And the simple answer is don't put so much compost in the tray. If the room and the kit is not designed to do it, you're never going to be successful. I think that temperature probes can be used very carefully to monitor compost. Again, in shelves or rooms, we used to, and I still do now with the case run, we move the probes to the outer zones once we think we are in control of the compost, because the room climate has a very different effect on the outer areas of your compost surfaces. And often you do see on farms areas which don't grow particularly well. First time I came out to this part of the world, I went to Australia in the early 90s, and I did a lot of work with the original Buller farm. And I got to know David Blunt and his partners very well, and they had a major problem with no mushrooms in the centres of their beds. And what we found is that mycelium was growing around the outside because the casing was compacted in the centre, and therefore the temperature was much hotter and it was damaging the spawn at that part. So you had super mushrooms down the edges of the shells but nothing in the middle of the bed. In terms of bubble wrap, at this stage in the spawn running, with a more basic fundamental farm, I have found it very useful to put it underneath the compost, which has helped to manage the energy cost and use more of the compost temperature. But I also found, interestingly enough, it was much less volatile. It came up more slowly, it went down more slowly. So you had more of a straight line to work with all the time, rather than having these big dips and troughs. It does also preserve, I think, a lot more moisture in the compost, which obviously you want for later in the cropping cycle. For us, it was a big problem during cold weather. So again, we could literally swaddle it all up, and at lower room temperatures, less energy again, we could manage the compost temperature. But I didn't particularly want to be much above 23 or 24, so I wasn't looking to push it up. So it had quite a different effect for us, and we always found when we were ready for casing that we had a more uniform mycelium to grow up into the casing from the compost. Okay, if we just have a little word about the spawn running, case running, sorry. For us, we've oh sorry, Stuart's not there yet. Okay. we felt that this was probably our area of greatest irregularity, and it's still an area that's of great interest to me, and it's usually my first port of call on the farm is to go directly to the casing, and I'm always very keen to see it if I can about a day to 2 days before it's going to be aired, because it'll tell you very quickly what has or has not happened. Depending on what the grower is saying his timing pattern is and how he's set up to run it, you should be in that finished state that there's nothing you need to do. If you're having to water, you'll physically knock it back, you'll knock the temperature out, you'll start to pre-pin, but you should not be watering at that point. So you need to go back again to see why you need that water. I do think that there is a link in what you do with the case run, which in some ways is stating the obvious about having a consistent airing pattern, but it does mean that you do need to make small adjustments on a weekly, daily basis. And I think the other thing, that even when you've got insulated rooms and a certain level of equipment, you have to take into account the outside weather, because if that changes, it does seem to change very much what may or may not go in. Where we are, we can get really quite cold and low humidity in the winter, and you can watch rooms dry up for no apparent reason that normally would be nice and warm and moist, and the only difference is that the weather has changed. So if the weather's changed, that must be changing the atmosphere in and around your casing layer. Something else that we learned through the work initially, we struggled, like I think many growers have done in the past, with having a second flush that was satisfactory. I think most of the time you get a good first flush and you tend to be fairly happy with that. But we were very unhappy with the second flush, and also the incentive to us is that we were offered another sale day on the Monday, but there was no way that I could do it from the first flush. But what I could do it with was using the end of the second flush if the quality was good enough to hold over the weekend. So our target was to be able to improve that second flush. That's where I started to use some of these complements, I should say, Stuart. And in conjunction with our own work, we had some real success very, very quickly. And I think the most important thing that I've seen from it, because I don't think complements are all about yield, was this enhancement to the quality. The mushrooms became more pickable, so the speed of picking was improved. It allowed us to start picking second flushes even 3 times a day. Previous to that, it had been a race to get it off before we lost it, because we were running out of nutrition and the mushrooms were opening on the beds. We didn't feel that we had got fully colonised in the right way at the right time, and we were watering badly. We were really watering from the point of view that somebody took a squeeze of the casing and it was too dry, so we put water in it. But we weren't taking on board how much damage that was doing, whether it was adjusting the temperature in the casing layer itself or knocking back the growth physically. And I've always tried to think about what I term a compost air average, and that gives me a casing temperature. And it's very simple. You know, you can go home and do it. The casing temperature is 25 and the air temperature is 18. You add the two together and you divide it, and it'll tell you roughly what the casing temperature is. So if that temperature is way below 22 degrees, 23 degrees, you're not going to get a lot of growth. You need to have that temperature up at that 23, 24, even 25, because the growing point is moving through the bed as time goes on. And I think it was mentioned before about gaseous diffusion, a very, very important feature of this. And again, we have not seen it affected by putting plastic on the surface of the bed. I suspect it's actually improved, because the plastic is perforated so it can breathe, but it can breathe under very good conditions of temperature, higher humidity and moisture, which is really what the mycelium wants at that point. We've also found that that growth is improved by the thoughtful use of both climate and water, and because the surface hi-fi is so sensitive, and that's something that I learnt with Stuart from Kerry Burton, he's retired sadly now, but he was a very good mushroom scientist in the UK, and he's done a lot of work on these areas, and a lot of it I think is beyond most of us because it is pure science. But if you can sort of get your head round one or two simple principles of almost what's wrong and what's right, it does seem to have a big bearing on what you're doing. We do roll the compost gently after ruffling, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but we never push the compost down hard. And I know I go on some farms, but particularly with farms I went on with Stuart in Ireland, the top of the casing is hard. Well, if the top of the casing is hard, you must be interfering with the evaporation through it, and you must have some form of surface sealing. If you've got surface sealing of the casing, how much of that evaporation is also being compromised for the pins once they start growing? We also like to stop our watering about a day before we air up. So again, we're fairly careful how we load the casing. We would make those adjustments early on if it was a very hot compost, warm, or we were struggling. We would perhaps put in regular half-litre waterings through the day just to try not to lose water, keep the floors soaked, keep the humidity up very high, but until we really start to move the compost temperature, we don't let water go down and trap it inside. That brings me on to structure and growth. Growth is optimum, obviously, with better casing application, which leads you to a much stronger crop, and also the spread. So if you have a structure, texture, aggregate, however you want to look at it, most of us are now working on trying to spread our mushrooms out a bit more, having a bigger, heavier mushroom for our pickers to pick, and perhaps picking 2, maybe 3 times a day over the main 3 days of the pick. You can certainly upset this if the airing is too harsh, and historically I think probably that's where some of our problems came from years ago, because we did have some pretty harsh airing patterns, to say the least. The compost could be dropped out very, very quickly. You've got a lot of excess drying, and then you obviously got a lot of damage to the surface mycelium, and you'd see these sort of situations where the mycelium would just turn over and start to dry off and wouldn't form any pins. When we're building up the water table, again, we tend to use multiple applications. We don't like putting too much water down too quickly. I think also it does show you how much your peat source is absorbing water, and everybody uses different products from different companies, but you can always add, you can never take away, and we've certainly made the mistake in the past of being a bit too clever, and people are suggesting that you can put 6-8 litres of water down round about day 1, and we can't, so we don't. And we've just found another way of doing it because it damages us so much. I'd like to really talk now about ruffling, whatever you call it. I know some people don't do it. We stopped doing it for a while for the reason that it was difficult to do with the physical setup of the buildings and the beds that we had. But I think it's actually a very important feature, and it certainly helps to give us, I would say, some of the success that we've had, because to a certain extent we create that structure on the bed. If we put too much water in our casing machine, we end up with something like a slurry. Now, there are growers, particularly places like Ireland, that have this very wet, cold, loose casing material, that they've found a way to seem to work with it, although at times I think it can be quite detrimental, and I've certainly been to farms where, you know, they virtually have no temperature 3 days later, and if you dig down into the compost it's completely full of water and black. It just hasn't grown any further. A good coarse structure allows moisture into the interface. So again, if you're feeding it down bit by bit, we tend to check in the morning, the afternoon, just to see where the moisture is, if it has reached the bottom, whether we can add more, or sometimes you'll find that it's filled up very, very quickly, and maybe that's a casing that's been stood outside the bog, there's been a lot of heavy rain on top of it, and it won't absorb water because it doesn't need water because it's full of water, so we come out of the program and we stop. We do find that it's very important to break a little bit of compost into the casing, but knowing that we're going to return, we don't overdo it. We just want to damage the surface a little bit and get a few bits of compost mycelium up into the casing. We stick very much to the same principles that I'm sure you've all been taught, had explained, found for yourself, that a drier casing will give you fewer and quicker pin heading. A wetter casing tends to be a bit slower, but it does give you more, and it definitely gives you a heavier mushroom. So if you are using a complement or something like that, it's an important part of what you should consider to use that type of product. The other thing that we do change a little bit, depending on, again, the weather, is how far up we bring the surface hyphae. I know that this can affect the pin numbers and slower growth, pin heading and so on and so forth. But if we find if we go too high when it's cold and dry, we get very bad lift of peat onto the second flush. So we just make that adjustment in the weather, hopefully to get there before it happens. Okay, this was our first ruffling machine that we butchered, I think, for want of a better expression. We took a number of the tines off it, and we didn't do it in a straight line. We tried to stagger it. So when the machine went through the casing, it didn't lift it all in the same place. So we were being left with different lumps, different structures all over the bed. Sadly, I haven't got a photograph of it, but the machine we now use, which is a bigger ruffler, and we've turned to round teeth instead of flat teeth, so that we do even less damage. What we have done is we've set it up like a combine auger. So instead of it drawing it to the middle, it's throwing it to the outside. So we're taking the density of the casing off the hot part of the centre of the bed, and we're building it up on the outside edge, which always tends to be shallow and dry out, and allow it to dry out down the sides of the compost. Again, very simple, with this aspect of too much casing in the centre. We don't have an oscillating head on this machine. We have a new machine coming, because when we put the next room up for the farm to give the full phase 3 cycle, we've got an oscillating head, and we'll use that machine to do the casing and the compost. We're going to stay with filling compost one day and filling casing the second day. I think some farms it can be quite difficult where you have a combination, because if you have got hot compost, there's not much you can do about it. So we just put a very simple splitter for the casing to fall on, and in fact it curls underneath, so you get plenty across the full width of the belt. And we use a simple hopper with a big rubber belt to feed the back of the casing machine. It falls onto that splitter plate from under through this guard, if you like, here, and there's a little rotor that's just turning, so that the casing is dropping over the top of this, and it's already starting to crumble and fall. It's being spread to the edge, and again, when we get to the other side, if I can go back, when we get to the other side of the levelling bars, I forgot to take the photo on this one, sadly, but we've another small rotor which is hidden literally behind this bar here. And what it does is it contra-rotates against the casing going down the shelf on the net, just to make sure again we structure it back up again. It also helps to get casing to stick together. We've staggered the teeth on it and we have different lengths. So nothing is in straight lines, nothing is smooth, there's always an aggregation. This photo here we use from the beginning right the way through. If we've problems with this room in particular, actually is difficult. It's 4 shelves wide, so to help, we do find we lose pins if we're not careful. So we sheet off the centre of the room apart from the bottom meter, and we move a lot of air round to go with the air in the building. And we use this all the time in the summer when the compost comes in to get in charge of the temperature. You can use 1 or all 3 fans, and if you can hardly stand in front of it when it's running. And it has a major impact on the farm. Okay, coming back with Stuart, believe it or not, those are actually 3rd flush mushrooms. These are portobellas, and it's very much been this quality shelf life that we've been interested in, not just yield. Here's another slide of the supplement going on to the casing. We actually put this on when we ruffle. We open the casing at application and leave it very rough so that the water can get right down into the bottom. We usually find that we're at the point of getting anaerobic, which I'm quite happy with, because we will then go through and do the proper ruffle. But anything that is anaerobic is going to be drawn in. And the afternoon before, we apply the casing drench, because we only want to apply up to about 1 litre of water after the work, just to even out the casing. We do not want to be in the position of putting a lot of water down and losing our timing. But as Stuart said, and the first time I did it, I was quite alarmed by the colour. Okay, that's the top bed above the one you've just looked at. That's sort of the following day, so what we're talking about, probably somewhere between 12 and 14 hours. The ruffling is completed, the water has been completed, and as you can see, there's a good structure there in which we can set pins. The funny colour has gone, and we are at a point, any more water and you'd be saturated and ruin the exercise. Going back to something I said a short while ago, I took this photograph actually just to show you that when we come to the latter part of the case run before airing up, we move the probes into the outer zones, because what's important to me is the air temperature. I know that the compost is warmer in the middle of the bed. It's not that warm and it's not going to do me any harm. It might be about 1 degree higher than the outside edge. So if that's 25, I might be 26 in the centre of the bed. But what I'm much more interested in is just running the room gently at perhaps 21 to 22 degrees, because I just want to grow and finish the casing layer off. In theory, I should have completed all the other tasks that I've suggested to you that we've done. This is an alternative in the summer when it's warmer. Instead of putting it on the bed, we put it round the bed. One of the other reasons that we use it, different from Stuart, is these rooms have a very high air bed ratio. So if you're not careful for most of the year, you can get a lot of pre-pinning. So if we just use the plastic, it does help in reducing that, and that's really where we started using the plastic originally. This is a shelf room with the perforated plastic on. That's the day before. We would air up by the look of that on the evening of that day. So everything is complete and finished. Okay, you can see here the quality of the mycelium as it's come to the surface. This is looking at that. That's probably about 3 days after airing. You can just see a few initials starting to form up on there. This is a day further on. There they are. You can see how it fills in, and the mycelium is occupying all these big cracks. So the different levels and numbers of pins that we get, that will help us to spread our picking out. This is obviously a couple of days later. That's the sort of pin set that we're looking for. Again, I hope you can see that lovely blue-white colour. I think the Dutch always refer to it as quality mycelium. That's what we're after, and I think, as Stuart was saying before, and I notice more and more, how much it grows out inside the bed. And you can see here, I think a very good example, you've the pins on the top. These huge black areas for water evaporation, and actually as you go through the crop this seems to expand. I don't know if you want to say any more about that, Stuart, as these bundles grow and fill out as you go through that pinning stage.
Well, no, only the fact that those thicker strands are actually lots of hyphae joined together. Yes, if you were to look at under a microscope, you can see probably tens of strands all together. Yeah, we have a feeling, we're not sure exactly, but we have a feeling that that is also helping to contribute to feeding later on. In other words, the feed isn't just happening from just one strand moving compost to the grow. Could be multiple points there where nutrients are getting into the seed.
The other thing for me to see at that stage, which would make me fairly comfortable, is this complete absence of a thick layer of mycelium coming off at that interface. And I know very well at this point we'll be growing a good second and a good third, because this pipe system, tubes, however you want to look at it, the casing has the ability to retain the moisture, to keep it subtle and open, so it's going to feed from the compost all the time. And particularly when it gets towards the end of the first flush and then that activity starts again for the second flush, the gate is open for it to pull up more protoplasm. Okay, I don't know if there's some areas of that people would like to talk about. Any questions?
Most of us in New Zealand would either cap or use CI.
Yeah.
How does the micro liquid work with ruffling compared to using CI?
I would imagine it doesn't have any difference at all, as whether it's CI or compost. The principle is about getting a leg up, getting a better average. I like lots of growers, and certainly as a young grower, I met a very interesting guy who worked for Hauser called Patrick Romanans, who was actually the man that invented the Growmaster, which is what CI became. And I worked with that for a long period of time. Was very happy with the results. I think what I find now is it's a cost I'm not using, but more importantly, it doesn't seem to have any effect by using compost. Whereas if sometimes when you use CI, if you're not careful, it's very easy to get too much growth. And that was what quite a few of us did find. And there were other products. Can you remember what the Somicel one was called? Something like that. And the casing was as white as that tablecloth. It just went berserk. And once obviously that mycelium was there, you couldn't do anything about it. So no, I don't see why there should be any difference. You're trying to do the same job with either a cacking product or compost.
So do you fill your room and then the next day
Yes.
put the casing
Yes.
on and then ruffle it the same day?
No, the compost goes in and is prepared for the casing, and then the casing goes on the following day. The ruffling machine is passed through the casing that afternoon. We usually put about 4-6 litres of water into the casing before the machine, so we leave a fairly open but coarse wet structure. So it doesn't interfere with the air movement. If it's still a bit warm, we can still get the compost temperature out, and it will sit like that through Saturday, Sunday, and then Monday we will finish off any watering. We don't normally water on a Saturday, but we usually have to put perhaps 2 4 litres in on a Sunday, maybe another 2 on the Monday. Then the complement goes in on the Monday afternoon. The ruffler goes through on the Tuesday morning. It's lightly compacted with the roller. If we're going to put the sheets on, the sheets will go on after that. We usually put a litre of water into the beds, and then it's aired up on the following day, which will be the Wednesday afternoon evening. So we've a 24-hour period thereabouts after the finish.
So you're doing ruffling day 6,
Day 5, yeah. I always treat any operation that we do, I always go back to day 0 and start again, because however quick it is, however clever you are, actually you've completely interfered physically and climatically in that building. So
do you use your compost capping from the same batch as well? Or
yes. Yeah, and I know some people tend to put stuff aside and keep it, but we always use the compost from that delivery. We just chuck a little bit in some buckets the night before, put a sheet over it so it warms up a little bit. And it's not a clever operation, it's literally a broadcast.
What day do you normally start harvesting?
Day 17, 18. We don't want to be picking a lot of mushrooms on a Sunday, Monday. What we want to really start with is sort of Monday afternoon, Tuesday. The peak of the farm sales are between Tuesday and Thursday, and between Thursday and Friday's picking is usually kept in the fridge for the following Monday, because the delivery vans leave about 4 o'clock on the Monday morning. We pick for if we had a main pick for the first flush on Monday through Thursday, we'd probably start the watering maybe on the Wednesday afternoon. We start our change to temperature atmosphere for the second flush on the Wednesday afternoon. We tend to bring the mushrooms in about 16.5, 17 degrees. Once it's set, we leave it fairly low. And then the Thursday we would be going well up to 20, 20.5, depending on the weather and what we thought in terms of the ping cull we need. Would be a main day for water. And then we would be returning to tidy up the second flush the following Monday, just take the odd bits off the bed to begin to flush, and then we would start picking the second flush popper on the Tuesday afternoon, clear by the clear by the Friday morning. So we can keep, with that timing schedule, we can keep all the picking in the middle main part of the week.
How long's the cropping cycle?
We grow between 2 and 3 flushes depending on sales and hygiene. If I had to deem that there is a hygiene risk, and in fact I think one of the reasons that I managed to get on top of my own farm was we just took the decision that we would not grow third flushes anymore, which put more pressure on this side of the work to get the yields, to get the sales. And as soon as we did that, the problems that we had with disease virtually went out of the window. If we do occasionally get quite badly affected with cobweb, and I think the reason for that is that the growing site literally sits in the middle of a series of wheat fields. So if they're moving soil or harvesting and this sort of thing, a lot of those spores are naturally being lifted up and taken in.
On a 3 flush, how many weeks would your cropping cycle be then?
We're working between 5.5 and 6 weeks. I think if we were pushed, we could do it in 5. But I don't want to be pushed, and we don't need to be. I think these things are great on paper, but sometimes when you have to carry it out, I think it creates a lot more stress than is perhaps necessary.
So starting from day 0 on field, 5 weeks? Or are you meaning from starting picking?
No, we start. You're filling on. You've got a 5-day case run, 5-6 day case run. You've then got 12 days to bring your crop in. Okay, and then you've got your picking period after that.
5 weeks.
So, you're 5 to 6 weeks. We have 6 rooms available, and we fill one every week. We empty one every week. We fill one every week. Okay.
Are you picking mainly into plants or into loose plants?
My picking was all into punnets, which was a nightmare because, like they always do, they give you 6 or 7 sizes. The bulk of these mushrooms in France go into a. It's not a loose tray as such, but a lot of the organic produce is in a sort of old-fashioned, light wooden pannier type thing. So it does help the picking a lot, and we don't have to do a lot of double handling with pallets. And our customer does not want plastic, which is great. End of. They just won't tolerate it.
Who regulates the organics there? Is it the French?
They have I can't remember what they call themselves, bio, but it's a bit like the English Soil Association. They are very strict. It's quite a big body actually.
Is that a national body or
Yes.
is that your own?
No. It's a French body, and we're in the Morbihan district, so we have that area. They're the ones that inspect and check the farm, and they will turn up when they feel like it, and you basically have to show them. Part of your organic status, if you like, is that they have the right to enter the premises, to check your raw materials, to check the mushrooms. You certainly get at least 2 visits a year. I don't know what happens if you get into trouble, because we haven't gone down that route, but I suspect it would be pretty grim.
Is there a lot of organic straw grown?
No, not. That movement is moving. I think going back to what we were saying earlier, and this is where I think Anna's been quite clever, because she's got together with some younger farmers who want to move away from mainstream agriculture, and one of them is actually very interested in. He's growing organic wheat at the moment. He's very interested in taking spent compost back, and so doing a swap. So again, we can look at the financial side of it, and I think it's something that will grow. There's been a big shortage of organic straw in Europe over this last year or so, and the price has gone through the roof. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure you get it, so. So, I think lunch is got good. No more questions? Anything else that I'd like to talk about?
Possibly with getting a little bit on profit, but how do you get on with the organics to getting the check?
Organic.
That's